anyone can operate by running the software. And so that's a public blockchain. If you've been hearing about JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and most of the world's top financial institutions are talking about incorporating blockchain technology into their businesses, they're not talking about using public blockchains. They're talking about using private blockchains, which is where instead of anyone having access to it, I decide which parties have access to it within a walled garden. Again, I like to use the analogy of the internet, which is when the internet was first emerging, Fortune 2000 companies didn't have any interest in using the public internet. They wanted to use things called intranets. And so this is essentially the equivalent of what you're seeing here. Private blockchains that don't have all the benefit of a public blockchain, but it allows you to get some of those things. And I think over time, everyone will end up migrating into a public internet, or in this case, public blockchain. And so some examples of what you can do as you start to digitize assets. Itbit is a company I'm invested in that said, let me digitize gold. So in the same way that I can transfer Bitcoin from one person to another around the world, why can't I do this with other assets? So we can start to digitize the world's commodities. We could also do that with currencies. The Philippines and a few governments around the world have already announced their interest in figuring out how do I issue my currency using this technology. So it's not Bitcoin, instead it's US dollars or Filipino pesos, which is compelling because you got about 100 million people in the Philippines and only about 5 million credit cards and bank accounts. So there's an opportunity for a government in this instance to issue through their central bank or their Federal Reserve a currency using this technology where anyone with a cell phone essentially has access. So you can see 5 or 6 billion people on the planet that don't have access to either are unbanked or underbanked. All of those people can have, sort of ubiquitous financial services. There's an opportunity for the developing world to essentially leapfrog the developed world, much in the same way that Africa went from having, skipping wired communications and going straight to wireless. Here's an interesting example of an art company that's saying, let me issue a certificate of authenticity in combination with that art, and so that you can no longer counterfeit art. I should wear tennis shoes today. Here's an interesting company. I guess people collect sneakers, but this group is issuing digital certificates of authenticity that's an RFID chip inside of your shoe. And if I want to sell that high-end collector's shoe, or think a Louis Vuitton bag, I would be transferring that digital token with it because they're unique. You can't counterfeit them. And this will bring about the end of sort of counterfeiting of all luxury goods. This is another company I'm invested in called Chain. They've partnered with NASDAQ. And NASDAQ is already live doing trades to settle and clear security transactions using the blockchain. So again, in the same way that a Bitcoin could be transferred, I can issue a stock certificate using this. And NASDAQ is doing that for what's called their private markets business, which is where you think of big tech companies prior to going public, things like Facebook. There's robust secondary markets where those stocks are trading. And NASDAQ is already live doing that using blockchain technology as the way to settle and clear stock transfers. The Australian Stock Exchange in the region has already announced that they're going to be doing the same thing, but they're looking to do it for the public markets. Financial transactions around the world typically clear on what's called T+3, or you have 3-day settlement. We're going to be moving to a world of essentially instant settlement and clearing, and again at negligible fees for any financial instrument or asset. Tyrion, I think, is another very exciting company I'm invested in, which is focused on land titling as well as healthcare. One of the advantages that America had as a nation is we had a clear chain of title surrounding property, which allowed there to be mortgages and loans. But a lot of the world doesn't have that sort of clear chain of title. And as we can start to do that with any asset, specifically real estate around the world, I think that that's going to be a big benefit for the developing world. So once you've digitized assets and they've all been issued using something like a blockchain technology, by nature it's digital. It also then becomes programmable. I can start to write rules into it. For example, Augur is a prediction market where, think about futures if you're in agriculture. You might often be buying some sort of futures instrument to mitigate some of the risk around weather conditions. It's almost like insurance. And so they've built an entire prediction market for futures type trading, but where there's no intermediary. I can actually write rules into it. For example, if I took a dollar bill out and I said, okay, I'd like to make a bet that it's going to rain tomorrow. One of you may say, I'd like to take that bet. We program the rule into the money so that it's going to check the weather conditions tomorrow based upon whatever data set we tell it to look at. And the money will automatically arrive in my wallet or yours based upon that outcome, again, with no escrow agent, no intermediary in the middle. You can program the asset to do whatever it is that you'd like. And you're going to, I think, see a lot of interesting uses of that. And so I think we're going to be moving from a world where agreements go from being legally binding to technologically binding. So if you're a young lawyer today in law school, I recommend you learn how to code. Because I think the law firms of the future are going to look a little like this. And that's probably also true of accounting. But also, so once you've now programmed assets, and we think about things like corporations, which are, again, paper sort of platforms, we now have the ability to create corporations or companies that aren't companies in the sense that they've not been legally incorporated anywhere. They're a piece of code that exists on the internet, which we refer to as decentralized autonomous organizations. If you've been following the news this week, I'm going to skip directly to this one because it's very interesting. DAOhub has raised about $150 million in the last 2 weeks to create the world's first venture capital firm, but where there's no legal incorporation, there's no entity that exists anywhere in the world, and there's also no venture capitalists. The money exists inside of a digital entity that resides on the web with no governing body, no central authority, no one manages it, and if you've put money into this vehicle, you own a token, and that token entitles you to a vote. And so anyone can now submit a proposal to this digital entity and say, I'd like you to fund my startup idea, and all of the token holders around the world, in a click can say, I approve that, I like it, and if a majority of the token holders around the world have approved that transaction, that startup gets funded. The prior one is an example of Uber, where they've said, I'm going to create a digital marketplace for driving, but where there's no legal entity, there's no Uber, there's no Lyft, and anyone can put themselves in it, and anyone can buy from it, but there's no entity. Again, it's a piece of software that is the marketplace, essentially connecting drivers and passengers. Here's an interesting one called OpenBazaar, which is a decentralized marketplace. So it's an entity that exists on the web where anyone can go buy and sell anything they want, but much in the same way as Bitcoin, it's software that can never be turned off. So you have permanent marketplaces that are going to exist there on the web. MadeSafe is doing the same thing with storage. So if you have a computer and you have extra disk space on it or a server, I can say I'm going to give 100 gigabytes of my disk to this giant network to create a decentralized version of Dropbox. And so if I want to get storage space, I'm going to pay digital currency for everything I use. And if I want to offer it up, I'm going to earn digital currency by offering up any extra disk space that I might have. Ethereum is doing the same thing with compute. So I think that much in the same way that the internet has impacted every business in the world and all of our lives, this technology is going to be just as prevalent, though you're not necessarily going to notice it. Much in the same way you used to make your phone calls over twisted copper wires, and when we migrated over to using voice over IP, unless you were in the telecommunications business, you never realized it happened. The back-end infrastructure of the world is about to change, and it's going to get better, faster, cheaper as a result of that. So this is happening now. Most of the world's top venture firms are all invested in the space. And here's the amount of capital that's gone in. So in 1995, the internet raised about $250 million in terms of venture funding into those companies. Bitcoin in 2014 raised about $350 million. Last year, Bitcoin raised about 780, call it 800 million. The internet raised about 600 million. So this sector has been taking in more venture capital than the internet did in 1995 and 1996. But the world has changed a lot since that. It used to cost you about $5 million to build a basic business to sell, sneakers online. Today, the costs to build a business have gone down by about 95 to 99%, depending upon the nature of the business that you're building, because of things like Amazon Web Services, because of things like open source software and GitHub, because of things like SaaS or software as a service. I don't need to build everything every time I want to do something. I'm going to grab and compile a number of different technologies to do that. So the amount of capital that's come into this space is going to create a whirlwind of innovation, though it takes time. That capital has to be deployed into products and services. So I'm financing a lot of those sort of companies. The internet wasn't very useful until you had some of that basic infrastructure like a browser and an email client and search engines. So again, like a protocol, this underlying technology needs bridges, roads, and tunnels. And that's where all this capital is being deployed today to build out that infrastructure and to also provide that technology to existing incumbents that may want to benefit from it. You're also seeing most of the world's top financial institutions have all come into the space. Incumbents face the innovator's dilemma, which is, okay, I see a new technology. Incumbents don't like disruption generally because the status quo is working for them. Unfortunately, you can't stop innovation. So most of the world's financial institutions were taking a look at this technology that was emerging and kind of ignored it initially, then decided, okay, I better understand it because there's a lot of interesting people, voting with their feet and their time and their money. And so the first thing that you do in that situation is you analyze the threats and the opportunities. And like all things, you're going to recognize that this is going to be disruptive in a bad way in some ways. For banking, correspondent banking, for example, I think is a segment of the banking world that's going away completely. But there's also a lot of opportunity that comes with it. Most of the financial institutions are focused on the middle and back office because we've seen a lot of innovation on the front sort of line of finance, algorithmic trading, high frequency, mobile banking, that the world's, we've been seeing a lot of progress there, but the middle and back office was still designed for a world of paper, 50 to 100 years ago, and it's very antiquated. And so they're focused mostly on that. You're not going to see a lot of top-line revenue growth amongst these organizations, but what you're going to see is a lot of expenses get cut out of the business as they can more efficiently run their businesses on these technologies. And some of the stuff's even older. Take trade finance, and we're in a city where that matters. $20 trillion a year is being transacted around the world, but we're running on 500-year-old technology, a thing called a bill of lading and a letter of credit, where you have a cargo container and a bearer share that says this is the person that's entitled to it. So that's an area that we're looking at. And beyond finance, most of what I'm financing today are healthcare businesses. So we're doing a bunch of stuff with Philips right now around using this for medical records. Again, the distributed ledger is not only for finance. It's any segment or industry where security matters, privacy matters, compliance matters, trust matters. And so all of these things are areas where you can see opportunities for this technology. So healthcare, insurance, legal services. I just funded a company called Stampery. I don't know how popular notaries are here, but it's a big aspect of kind of trade to say, this is who I am. And so we built a service where you can integrate it into your email, and you create an immutable record around every document you have, which is time-stamped, hashed into a blockchain, and you can always go back and access it. And so for a fraction of a penny, everything you do can be notarized. And so this is not just a finance thing. I think every industry in the world is going to get impacted by it. But I think I'm out of time. Thank you.